Now, the guy shaking his hand or handing him something is Russell Nelson. He's now still alive. He's 101 years old. Does that look like a 98-year-old man sitting there? And those are his other flunkies. They were getting permission from Bergoglio to build a huge Mormon temple in the suburbs of Rome. Okay, and what I figured out, and along with other people, is that when the heat comes down about the Ninth Circle in the Catholic Church, the Ninth Circle just moves their operations into the Mormon temples. It's back and forth. We know that from a Mormon eyewitness named Asia Dutson, and I worked with her for a while. And Asia said that there's a tunnel linking the main Catholic cathedral in Salt Lake City, Utah, with the Mormon temple. She was taken down there as a child. Her father, Ray Barraclough, who was an elder in the Mormon church, took her down there. Again, ritual torture, but also medical experimentation going on. And so these guys, it's really like a dual operation, the Mormons and the Catholics, but they hide behind the rhetoric of condemning each other as pagans to hide the fact that they're really the two biggest banks and real estate companies in the world when you look at their assets and the way they operate.
So you're getting asked to just give a basic definition of what a Mormon really is.
It's funny because half the Mormons who are interviewed don't believe they're Christians. So it's sometimes it's portrayed as a Christian cult, other times as a quote pagan cult. It was started in the mid-1800s by a guy called Joseph Smith back in Ohio. And he said that he had a vision where this angel called Moroni showed up. Now, it's moron with an I on the end, so I like to just call him the moronic angel. But anyway, the Moroni shows up and hands him golden tablets, which turned out to be the Book of Mormon. And a long, very arcane description of how God lives on another planet and sent Moroni to redeem a certain elect people. It's a typical kind of millenarian cult. But Joseph Smith is the only one who witnessed it. So we're all going on his word that maybe he was on a drunk, maybe he had a hallucination, But everyone believes in this encounter between Joe and and Moroni. And so on that basis, they start this movement. They do get attacked by their neighbors. And so they, under the pretext of being persecuted, they move west and they start a theocratic state in what's now Utah. Utah is basically run by the Mormons in every way, economically. And it's interesting because China, we learned recently that China has been funding a lot of money through Salt Lake City and are using the Mormon influence in the U.S. government to kind of influence things in America. That's kind of a whole other thing, brings in the China factor. But anyway, they camp out around the time of the Civil War in Utah, what's now Utah. They set up this theocratic state run by a guy called the Prophet, who's like Russell Nelson, the child killer nowadays. And they start killing all the Gentiles. Anyone who isn't a Mormon is called a Gentile, and it's open season on other settlers moving through the area. There was a good movie made about that with John Boyd. I forget the name of it, but it's about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, where they brought in a couple of hundred settlers heading to the coast, threatened them that the Ute Indians were about to kill them all, disarmed them, then massacred all of them, and kept the children and raised them as Mormons. They even got in a conflict with the U.S. Army. There was a running battle between the U.S. cavalry and the Mormon state. Eventually, they worked out a deal where basically the Mormons get to run Utah as their own, kind of private operation, just like the Catholics do, untouched by U.S. law. So again, another parallel there, right?
So when I was living in Arizona, which is not so far away from Utah, I remember there was programs on the TV and arrests whereby one of the methods of the Mormons was the interbreeding with the young women.
Yeah.
And they would run out the young men so that there was more of these young women available for the elders. And it just seemed like a pyramid scheme.
Well, it's a polygamous culture. So men are expected to take multiple wives. And, my Aunt Danielle on my mom's side was a Mormon, and it was horrible. She kept marrying these guys who would beat her up, go off to hookers during the week, and then they'd get up on Sunday in the Mormon church and confess, and everyone would be all happy that he confessed, and he'd go back to the hookers during the week, right? Kind of typical religious sanctification for whatever sin you want to do, right? But Danielle divorced her husband, Terry, for beating her so much. Danielle gets expelled from the Mormon church, not Terry, because she dared to go against her husband. It's believed, the Mormons believe that women don't get into heaven unless their man brings them through, whether it's your father or your husband. So you've got to be completely compliant. For a long time, they didn't let in blacks because they believed the blacks were inferior. Like in the Bible, Noah's 3 children, Shem is dominant over Ham. This is how they justified apartheid too, that one biblical quote that the white man is superior to the black. And they only recently set up a black Mormon church. It's still segregated, officially. So, I mean, there's that long, kind of mess that's associated with these people.
So how come occasionally there are arrests and exposés on the Mormons, the kind of stuff that I saw? Was that just showcasing that they're cleaning house and really sacrificial lambs?
Yeah, it's like with the present Pope. There's a thing online saying when he was bishop in Peru, he discovered abuse going on in one of the Catholic sects and he uprooted it, right? No, I mean, when those things happen, it means he goes in to cover it up and then they spin it to make it look like he's discovered a few child rapists. And it's always the bad apples theory. It's just bad priests who are doing this. But the point is reminding people the Catholic policy, a century old, of Crim Solicitanus that says everyone must suppress the evidence of child rape and never tell the police. From Pope right down to the woman sitting in the pew by herself, they're all expected to protect child rapists, which is a criminal conspiracy under the law, but like Mormons, they get away with it, right?
So currently the way it's set up, doesn't the gene pool start to get a bit incestuous?
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, it's funny when you go and talk to Mormons, a lot of them are like blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans. It was an early experiment in genetic engineering, social engineering. And the fact that they were doing that was part of the MKUltra experiments. And that's why not only they have so much money, but they have such a favored status with the US government. We talked about how the CIA and the FBI recruit inordinately out of the Mormons. There are a lot of Mormon feds, right? And they were groomed that way. I mean, a lot of them went through these experiments, and you got to not only follow the money, but the political military power when it comes to these cults, because a member of a cult is pre-adapted to be controlled and to hand over a lot of their money and to be part of a tyranny, right? That's why they rely on cults like the Church of Rome or the Mormons, right?
Yeah, when I started out as a stockbroker, one of my competitors in the office was a Mormon, and most of his clients were Mormon. And it was like just this big money funnel that was just going through this network of Mormons.
Yeah, well, some of their investments, last year, they're run by an investment firm called Ensign Peak. And their investment portfolio last year alone was $56.8 billion. They're heavily invested in Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, lots of stock, bond, real estate in a huge way, and Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals. Now, Eli Lilly had a deal going back almost a century where they would fund theological colleges in return for getting children for their drug testing experiments. And so it's very significant. They're tied into Eli Lilly. There's probably Mormon involvement in those experiments for a long time, right?
So what range of crimes are you aware of in the Mormon Church?
Everything we've always talked about in relation to the Ninth Circle, anything you can imagine and even worse. Ritual torture, murder of children, things that, when you hear about, you just think they're out of some bad horror movie, but it's all the same stuff. It's the same practice going on. One of the Polish women was, when I was talking to her, kind of off the record, because she's stuff she doesn't want to share yet. But she said she saw a whole basement area where children were in cages, and they were missing body parts, like missing eyes, nose, things. They were being worked on. They were being like vivisected, like experimental animals. I know that from Canada, confirmed at what's called the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, which got lots of money from CIA for MKUltra experiments. Joseph Mengele and all those Nazi doctors came and worked at the Allen Memorial in Montreal. And Ann Diamond, one of the eyewitnesses, said she saw this Nobel laureate, this Nobel-winning neuroscientist, Wilder Penfield. You can look him up. He's lauded all over the world. He was experimenting on native children, kind of had their head open. It was doing brain experimentation on them and removing parts. And she said she saw him strangle a native girl to death on the table because she wasn't cooperating. She was fighting. So it's that kind of level of horror. And the best defense is nobody wants to believe that. Like the very people who have the best reputations are the one with the bloodiest hands in this stuff. So, it's along that line. And fortunately, we're gonna in the fall when the case begins, the prosecutor is going to be making public as many of these testimonies as possible that don't actually endanger the eyewitnesses or other people. But that'll all be coming out in the fall, hopefully.
So it seems that the Vatican is insulated legally because it's a law unto itself with its own intelligence agency, etc. With the Mormon Church, isn't it based in the United States of America? And doesn't it make more vulnerable to legal penetration?
No, because a practice for many centuries is that churches have their own jurisdiction. I had that, when I was thrown out of the United Church for exposing this stuff, I appealed the kangaroo court that threw me out without any due process. I went to the Attorney General of British Columbia, and he wrote back a letter 5 months later saying the internal processes of a church are outside the jurisdiction of this ministry. In other words, outside the laws of Canada. This is the Attorney General, right? And he doesn't mind putting that in writing because he knows there'll be no consequence, because all governments of the world do this. They allow religions to be their own jurisdiction. And there's been a long history of that. I mean, that's why there's been so much genocide in the world. Who led the genocide? It was coming out of Rome, but it was missionaries first who would go into an area, spread the smallpox, soften up the population, brainwash the minority. And, it's the same old game all along, right?
Yeah, and we see the sacrifice of children. It's ritualistic. There's kind of an energy extraction. Do you see parallels in the Mormon rituals with that?
Oh yeah, like Asia Dutson, who was one of the Mormon eyewitnesses. Her name was Barraclough. Her dad, Ray Barraclough, was an elder when she was pre-verbal. It was as a young baby. He had her in a cage, and they would come and experiment on her. He locked her underground in a coffin. It's all designed to traumatize, create multiple personalities that can then be used as sleeper agents, sleeper assassins, all that usual stuff. But she said that early on of her conscious self, by the time she was about 5 or 6, they used to take her down to Mexico. They'd put her in a meat locker and transport her illegally across the Rio Grande into Mexico and to be used down there. And she said during one of those ceremonies, she would leave her body, because that's often a similar reaction when you kind of dissociate and you leave your body. And she was watching what was happening. And she said she saw what looked like Satan manifesting right in the middle of the ceremony. And, and it was like a big void, kind of like what I felt I was standing outside when I was in St. Peter's Square doing that exorcism. It's like this nothingness. And she felt that her soul was being like sucked right into this and feeding this thing. And she said she saw it feeding off many souls all over the world, not only in these ceremonies, but she saw it as an octopus with tentacles everywhere, right? And that's kind of one of the stories she passed on about that. So this is, very serious stuff, right?
Wasn't Ted Bundy drawn to the Mormon area, and was that some kind of camouflage he was trying to?
I'm not sure. That rings a bell, but I don't know enough about that to say.
All right, let's talk about the Mormon Church's ties to the U.S. government and China.
Well, I mentioned before, there was a news article last year, I think, in CNN that said that China had been using Mormon politicians. Like that fellow, I forget, he ran for the Republican nomination a couple of times back, Mormon senator. Using them to influence DC about some of their trade policies and that. We talked a little bit already about the role, how important the Mormons have been in the post-war American government with the MK Ultra. Okay, there he is. Russell Nelson, he's the guy. Let me just divert for a minute to talk about him. He personally raped and tortured Asia Dutson and many other children. She saw him kill children. He's a doctor, so she saw him doing experimental brain surgery on children to make them more compliant. He apparently also was responsible for the death of several top Mormon leaders. Let me just bring up this article. This is Asia Dutson speaking in an interview I did in 2019. Russell Nilsen may be the prophet, but he's also known as the killer. I know someone who saw him continually rape children as young as 5. I know people who were tortured by him as children. When somebody's to be killed, Nilsen's the one who schedules it, and sometimes he performs it since he's a doctor. He's performed rituals of aborting babies, killing the fetus, cutting it up and eating it, and drinking his blood, just like the Ninth Circle. I know he performed an abortion on his own niece. He's vile. He was